Digital well-being in the pandemic. That is the topic of our final session here at the festival. Now, I myself, as a teacher, have been dangerously close to screens, apps and devices, apps that are supposed to help with school. By the way, too much screen time is really great for migraines. You know that, right? Exile became my best friend. Now, the physical issues of too much screen time, like Zoom fatigue, bad posture, etc., notwithstanding, the cyber dangers of it are even more overwhelming and tend to have more unpleasant social repercussions and are more difficult to navigate. WhatsApp being hacked, spam forwards, lottery messages have been around for ages. But there are very unique challenges that our children are facing in the wake of being forced to be in this digital world without being properly armed to tackle possible backlashes. Once I shared the screen of an educational web page at an online lesson, and suddenly, upon being shared, it suddenly started featuring all sorts of ads and student inappropriate pictures that I couldn't even close, that I wasn't even allowed to close as I was scrolling. We're coming to you live from the Goethe Institute, where we will now move on to a panel discussion on this topic of digital well-being in the pandemic. This discussion will be moderated by Sanjit Dias, who is an attorney at law, who has also been a part of the Digital Wellbeing Initiative, being involved in the workshops with children, especially looking into the legalistic aspects of online presence and the digital world. So Sanjit, over to you.
Thank you, Pemanti. And we warmly welcome our online audience joining us for this panel discussion. And we hope that you were also able to catch some of the artworks that were premiered just before this. We are joined this afternoon by Mahisha Balraj from #Generation, Shakya Nathavitarana, who was one of the young artists involved in the Reconnect Us project, Tanushi Disanayaka from the Information Communication Technology Agency, or ICTA, and Christy Xavier from the Digital Wellbeing Initiative. To start things off, we will hear from Mahisha. Mahisha is a co-founder and director of #Generation, where she leads a team that is committed to identifying and countering harm online and ensuring a safe online space for all individuals and communities. She is also an attorney at law in Sri Lanka and specializes in human rights and family law. She holds a bachelor's of laws and a bachelor's in electronics and communication engineering, and so her work is in the intersection of law, technology, and policy. Mahisha is going to be sharing with us some thoughts on online misinformation. So over to you, Mahisha.
Thanks, Sanjit. Thanks for the introduction. And also I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers, a special mention to the curators, Stages Theatre Group, for really, and also all the artists and contributors in putting this Children in Lockdown Arts Festival. I've had the opportunity to follow a few discussions and also witness some of the premieres, and was truly and thoroughly impressed by the potential of the children of our country. And in such dire times that prevail in the country, it's real, true, positive optimism. Like Sanjit mentioned, my focus of discussion today, among other topics other esteemed panelists will be sharing, is going to be on false news. And also, maybe before we dive into false news, I would like to take this opportunity to step back a little and look at life of the internet and how we interacted with the internet pre-lockdown, and then move forward into talking a little bit about the types of false news that we encounter, and also leave you with a little bit of deeper insights into what we can do, what's in our capacities to do to kind of counter and address this issue of the spread of misinformation and disinformation. So since I was a teenager, through school and through university, our dependency and interaction with the internet has slowly and largely increased. And especially now with social media, we've sort of become dependent on it. And our lives have sort of are kind of now being built around technology, especially with the world of social media. And in that, we see how the internet has really been a positive space. For example, the fact that we're actually able to do this whole festival in a hybrid manner and really bring it to the people in using the online platform and the technological tools that are available, we're actually able to have dialogues. We're able to uphold democracy. And so while the optimism of the technological space exists, over the last decade, we have also seen that there is a flip side to this, where we're now encountering harm online. Among many other things, a common word that we hear today is hate speech. We hear other things like mis and disinformation. There's a lot of harassment and cyberbullying online, and we were able to witness this through the PSAs that were premiered just a short while ago. With that, what did really lockdown then do? With the lockdown, like Enceleta's piece, Trapped, it really gave children and families and individuals absolutely no option. Her piece being titled Trapped, I think that was the initial reaction, and over a period of time, that's how we sort of internalized the lockdown. People had a tendency of being trapped because we were all confined to our devices, be it learning, be it school, be it our work and professional lives. Everything sort of merely then were confined to these devices. And she kind of beautifully brought that message out in her visual piece. And further on from Enceleta's piece, she talks about the different emotions that we feel because as a repercussion of it. She talks about depression, she talks about anxiety. And with all of these mixed emotions and us being then exposed to this social media, the true question is, how do we then consume this information critically? Because we're right now in an age of information disorder. Malin, in his artist talk, also spoke to us about how we've moved away from the gatekeepers of librarians and news media outlets becoming the source of information and news, to us as individuals becoming the sources of information. And most often than not, we see that the generation of today is relying on the social media for news. For example, hardly do I read some of the newspapers. My first turnaround to a piece of information is on Twitter or is on some social media platform. So with and we've sort of seen, and with that I sort of bring my focus into sort of the false news. And in this age of information disorder, how do we decide what is false and what is true, right? We don't necessarily come from journalist backgrounds. So as individuals, then what is in our power to discern from when we see a piece of content from what is false and what is true? We saw in the PSA of a little boy, Nishan, who sort of spreads misinformation, right? And this is true to many of us because it's not sometimes intentional, it's unconscious. Right? You see a piece of information, you believe it to be true, and the next thing you know, you're liking it, you're sharing it, and you're sort of spreading this false news. And before I go a little further, maybe I would like to, for the purposes of clarity, I would like to also go a little deeper into what is really this false news and what are these terms that we're throwing around. We're saying misinformation, we're saying disinformation. And there's this other term of malinformation. So maybe we'll just take a look at what these are, and so that it helps clear up the discussion as I go further. So really, we look at whether the news is true or false, and then you look at the intent of the person who's creating that piece of news. So misinformation is when the information is false, but somebody who's creating it or sharing it, or the origin of that information, they didn't really have an intent to cause harm. So it's really your WhatsApp groups where aunties are sort of sharing things, or your instant messaging, your forwarded as received. So those messages, you really see some of them are harmless. There's no intent to cause harm. But you see that they are spreading like wildfire on instant messaging platforms and on social media. So that's your misinformation, where it's the information is false, but the intent, there is no intent to cause harm. Then we talk about disinformation. Disinformation is when the piece of content is false, as well as there is an intent to cause harm. So for example, you're spreading, if we really talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a piece of content that talks about a burial issue, and then sort of also then talks about a certain community, ethnic community. And you know that they're doing that to cause harm and prejudice a certain ethnic minority. So such type of content, then really sometimes in Sri Lanka, we've seen that this results in offline violence as well, right? And the third type being the malinformation. So malinformation is when the information is true, but the intent is, there is an intent to cause harm. So for example, if I were to draw on something, it's the information is true because it could be something that happened 2 years ago or 3 years ago, an incident from the past, but it's recirculated with the intent to take it out of context and prejudice the minds of people. So we're really looking at 3 different types of content that is out there and that we're consuming on an everyday basis. Because you and I are the consumers of this information, and you and I invariably are the creators of these pieces of information as well. So now more than ever, we have come to a time where it's really important to focus on how critical we are when we consume this information. And sort of Malin in his artist talk sort of set the foundation for this and talked a little bit about the different things that you can do to be critical of this information. I'm just going to dive deeper. And as part of my work with #Generation also, one thing that we're doing is we're sharing these skills called critical thinking in the digital age. We're trying to impart on these skills because it's not sort of mainstreamed, or it's not integrated into formal curriculum, but these are skills that we need today. It's the skills of the day also. And like, for example, the technology is going to be rapidly changing and evolving, but the laws, the education system is unfortunately not keeping up to that pace. So we as individuals have to take on that responsibility, inculcate these skills, and as individuals do our part and be critical of the way that we consume information. And this information can be news, it can be entertainment, it can be from the media. So it's really then left to us as individuals to sort of hold a structure and hold the space as a democratic space and make it a safe space. So we all, of course, don't come from journalist backgrounds, and I'm not going to ask you to embark on this long investigative journalist process. I'm just going to leave you with a few things, especially for children, and especially because we don't want to become another Nishan. I would like to leave you with a few things that is in our power to do. The starting being, we always see these clickbait headlines. There's always, for example, we've seen the secret truth about Pania, or you won't believe what just happened after taking the Sinopharm vaccine. Things you didn't know about garlic and COVID-19, and there's these clickbait headlines. What we need to understand is the publishers or the people who, sort of the websites or people who run these platforms and websites, they want clicks. Clicks is equivalent to money for them. So they really want you to just come and click on their link because sort of they run ads on these pages and they want more people to come on these pages so that then they can buy and sort of demand for a higher monetary value for their ads, right? So the next time you see a link like that, a clickbait headline, just be careful about, think twice before you click those headlines, right? For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, during the lockdown, we were blaming the virus on aliens. We were blaming the virus on astrologers. We were blaming the spread of the virus on certain ethnic groups. So all of these being clickbait headlines, so the next time you sort of come across them, just be mindful. And the next one, the second one, being conspiracy theories and miracle cures, right? At the time of the pandemic, during the lockdown, all our emotions were sort of out of the normal. There was a lot of emotion of anger, of frustration, and really strong emotions during that time. So what social media companies, what these people who create pieces of information and source of content do, is they're trying to really piggyback on those emotions that you have, and the pieces of content then really wants to sort of use those emotions that you have and then get you to act on it. So what they want you to like it, they want you to share it without thinking because you're acting on your emotion. So there is this psychology researched technique, and in layman's term, I'd like to say it is name it to tame it. So if you feel angry, take a moment away from the screen and try and say what you're feeling, the emotion, and that will help you rationalize your action. So the next time you see something, you get angry and you want to share it on WhatsApp groups, you want to like it, just be mindful, see what you're feeling, and then choose your action wisely. The third one being, also just maybe to give a few examples, the cure to COVID-19 you didn't realize you had in your own kitchen. I think I'm also sort of may have been prey to some of those with the garlic scam and different things like that. So yeah, so with that then maybe the third thing that I'd like to leave you with is the source. Try and identify the source. A friend of a friend is not a source. We often have these forwarded as received tagline to anything that we receive on WhatsApp. That's not a source either. Sometimes it's not very hard to sort of take an institution like the World Health Organization, WHO, or the Ministry of Health, take their logo, put it on something, create a piece of content. So just because there's a logo on it, just be sure to make sure to go on their official web pages or their social media accounts before you share that kind of piece of content. And then another thing that you can also look at is the date. Sometimes, like I said, malinformation, where a thing from the past can be circulated can be taken out of context and be circulated as news and as information pieces today. So we really want to stay away from that as well. So maybe a Google search, a simple Google search will help you reveal that information. And it then really misleads people because the information is true, but it's taken out of context. So we really want to stop the spread of that kind of misleading content as well. The next one being, when you see a piece of content, see if it's reliable. Look at the language, look at the grammar, look at the images that they have used. Sometimes some US image or something from India is then made as if it's a Sri Lankan story, be it the pandemic, be it the post-Easter Sunday attacks. We see all of this and then we think it's actually true. So a simple thing like a reverse Google image search will help you bring out the fact that those are not really Sri Lankan. Those don't belong to us. And it's really taken out of context and some news is created out of it. If you also just head down to, we always scroll on our feeds, and if you sort of scroll down onto the comment section, then you'll be able to actually tell what others are talking about it. If there's already people discrediting it and people already sort of labeling it as false news. So you want to sort of see what others are thinking if you're not really sure about what that piece of content is. And another thing, this is not an obvious one, but look at who's creating that content and see if they have another agenda to it. See if they're selling a product, or see if they belong to some political affiliation, because they obviously have their own agenda and they want to promote it. So yeah, these are just a few of the tips and tricks that I can leave you with. And we'd like to sort of delve deeper into another discussion of other different types of harms online. And with that, I'd like to only say, don't be a spreader of false news. Break the chain, don't be a Nishan. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mahisha. I think that was very helpful to help people try to pin down some of the ways to avoid or to discern between information that is credible and that might not be as reliable. I think Marlene and I once discussed this issue about there's a very strange disconnect between how humans, when they interact in person, are typically very suspicious and very cynical. So if someone were to tell you something in person, you wouldn't take it at face value. But somehow, when we get this information out of the ether in some public forum or in some WhatsApp post or a share, we tend to, ascribe it a lot more credibility. So that's an interesting one to explore maybe later on. So we will now hear from Shakya Anathavitarana. She was one of the young artists who was involved in the Reconnect Us project. She has a diploma in psychology from the University of West London and is currently pursuing a degree in psychology and is completing an ATCL in communication skills. She's also a part-time teacher, podcast host, and an aspiring entrepreneur. Shakya is going to be sharing some of the young people's experiences in lockdown with a particular focus on cyberbullying. Shakya, over to you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me here today. So from a student's perspective, I think that as children, we've had to face a lot of problems, especially in this time of the pandemic. But of all the problems that we've had to face, that we portrayed in the artwork that we just saw a while ago, from having a lot of emotional turmoil to not knowing how to adapt to online schooling and finding that difficult, through all of that, I think the biggest challenge that we have faced is learning to really manage and navigate the digital world. And with the time of the pandemic and a new era and a new threat, I think it's only natural for us to feel lost and not really know how to navigate the world and feel alone in it and be lost to answers as to what we can do. And things like Zoom fatigue, to be honest, seem very hard to accept, but they are indeed very real, and there are reports on how you can better manage your stress on Zoom and the fatigue caused by extensively staring at a screen. But things like Zoom fatigue seem a very minor problem in comparison to the ocean of problems that we as the youth have to face with the problem of everything having to be digitalized. For starters, the reports indicate that in Sri Lanka, the number of cyberbullying cases have risen to 8,000 in over a span of 6 months. And that's a drastic number of cyberbullying cases to be reported in such a short span of time. And I'm reminded of this quote, which says that the mind of a child is fragile, and their emotions touch their future, while your words shape their destiny. And as we saw in our PSA video a while ago, a girl was sharing her weight loss journey, and a group of acquaintances, instead of encouraging her on, were poking fun at her and asking her when the next plastic surgery was due. And we may not think of it, but these comments do leave emotional scars. I was privy to a situation online where a group of people were poking fun at me. And even though I am at the cusp of being an adult, it did make me feel small, and it did make me feel sad as well. So we need to acknowledge the fact that for certain, these are not minor problems. These do leave emotional scars, and children do need help. And the sad thing is that the mind of a child is fragile, and children as young as 12 years are exposed to this immense cruelty. And the mind of a child that is initially full of wonder and brightness is suddenly made dim and dark by cold, harsh reality. And what we are noticing constantly is that children can't handle the social world and the digital world and the cruelty that it bears. So, that being said, I think we often think of bullying as child's play. We'll say, you know, children are being children, they'll call each other names. But to hurt someone in a way that makes them feel small is no child's play at all. And so I don't think the definition of bullying is limited to calling somebody names. It's the entire act of intimidating, harming someone emotionally and mentally, and persisting despite the fact that you realize they're uncomfortable with it and they're made to feel upset and sad. That, I think, is what bullying is. It's a much wider scope than what we see. And unfortunately, when it comes to cyberbullying, you can't really confront your bully unlike you can when it's happening in school. I'm not justifying bullying that takes place in school. It is in no form or fashion right. But you can't necessarily confront your bully, and the worst part is if you're being cyberbullied, the person bullying you is a complete stranger. And you don't need to go very far. Just like we showed in our PSA video, if you scroll through Instagram or YouTube videos, you're bound to find a comment of somebody saying something nasty to a person they've probably never even met. So, having acknowledged the fact that bullying is a serious threat, that it does harm people, I'd also like to stress on one thing that I came across a book, and that also Malin mentioned in his video about Reconnect Us and the project that we did. This book mentioned that a potential reason a bully bullies you is probably because you are a reflection of who they want to be, or they're going through some emotional turmoil that they don't necessarily know how to deal with. Now again, you can't justify this and you can't say it's right. It's definitely wrong. But even then, I can't help but genuinely feel a sense of sympathy and sadness for the bully themselves. Because to see someone as a reflection of who you want to be means that you're insecure with who you are. You're not happy with yourself. You're uncomfortable with who you are. And the problem with all of this is the fact that people channel this insecurity and bully another person, call them names, and make them feel terrible about themselves. That is where the problem lies. So I think we also need to focus on the bully and teach the bully healthy methods of coping with what they're feeling, teach them how to not be insecure and be comfortable in their own skin, but also teach the victim that it's important to stand tall and firm in the face of bullying. Now, while we all do agree that social media is indeed a very interesting platform that we are all drawn to and that we all enjoy, I think there are people who fall on the other end of the spectrum as well. For instance, I have a group of friends who are immensely afraid of social media. They would do anything to stay away from it. Better yet, they show no interest in it. They would much rather be reading a book on a Saturday evening rather than scrolling through Instagram. Now, I must confess that I think to a certain degree I would fall onto this spectrum as well. I'd probably prefer reading a book than scrolling through Instagram sometimes. And sometimes we think that this is the type of person to strive to be. The type of person we want the youth to be is not touched by social media and not influenced by it. Now, I got social media only when I was 18. And I realized that being exposed to social media at 18, there was so much I didn't know about the digital world. And it wasn't until I got caught in a very creepy situation on social media that it dawned on me that there is danger lurking behind the screen. So one of my friends also came to the realization that whenever exams were around the corner, whenever a big event was about to take place, we would constantly binge watch a ton of TV series and movies, and our overall screen time was at an all-time high. And so social media didn't become a platform to simply share stories and ideas and perspectives. It had become a crutch which we were using to deal with the anxiousness we felt, the stress of studying and all the other things that we were going through, as opposed to directly addressing what we truly felt deep within. So the answer, I don't think, is for our generation to be disconnected from social media, because you can't. It is going to be there, and it will continue to be there. This is the world that we live in. And sadly, most things in life are not black and white. There's a gray area. Not everything that comes, or as we've seen in this time of the pandemic, technology is truly immensely powerful. It isn't entirely bad, nor is it entirely good. There's a gray area that we need to see and acknowledge. I was also someone who was very oblivious to a lot of things, and it wasn't until I joined the Reconnect Us workshop that it really dawned on me that information was being collected. I found it queer that my YouTube recommendations were based on a lot of things that I was interested in and watched, but I didn't see this as a mode of collecting information, and their privacy was being infringed upon. I've also been very gullible and the laughingstock at family gatherings for sharing information that I would consider to be accurate, which came from a chain message. So, having have seen that, I've also seen individuals, including myself, really struggle with the idea of putting yourself out on social media. Sometimes you want to, but you're just apprehensive about the whole idea, or at times you can't be bothered and you're oblivious to it completely. So the idea is not to be disconnected. It is to reconnect, really. And I realized that while a lot of people came and told me, Shakya, it's fantastic that you don't want to be a part of social media and you're really disconnected from it. Looking back at it and thinking deeply, I realized that that's not the person to strive to be, because I was ill-equipped as an individual to handle the social and digital world. So, and also the beauty of it all is that unless we consciously yet wisely expose ourselves to it, we can't find the middle ground. We have to be exposed to it to understand the dangers, the threats that it bears, and also consequently find a middle ground where we don't overdo it and get drawn unnecessarily to it. So I'd like to end with the fact that, as we portrayed in one of our videos, the only thing constant in life genuinely is change. But in this time of change, it is not our circumstances that need to change, but us.
Thank you, Shakya. One of the things I would like to pick up from what you shared was the idea about the comment section, because I think there have been studies done as well on the way people behave when they are in groups compared to, so they say that the way individual men behave is typically very different from the way men behave when they are in groups, whether it is what they call teams of workers on construction sites, the sort of parodied idea of men in construction sites, wolf whistling at women or catcalling and so on. And so I think apart from the anonymity that happens online, I think it's also to do with this group dynamic, that when you see other people are doing the same thing, you also do something. It's a sort of peer pressure, I suppose, that you would otherwise not do in a normal setting. So speaking about, seeing as Shakya touched on some of the dangers online, we will next hear from Tanushi Disanayaka, who is an attorney at law by profession, currently working as a legal officer at ICTA. She graduated with both her LLB, specializing in business law, and Masters in International Business Law from Staffordshire University, UK. And in her career as a corporate lawyer, she has been serving predominantly in banking and manufacturing industries before joining the information and communication technology sector. Tanushi is going to share some insights from her work, including on the legal background around some of these issues. We look forward to hearing from you, Tanushi.
Thank you very much, Sanjit, and good evening to the fellow panelists and those of you who are hearing us from your respective homes. In my capacity as a legal officer working in the information and communication technology industry, I have become privy to the dangers and the users of IT and the communication sector. And I have seen the good and the bad in the worst ways possible. Because in my line of work, I am actually part of the digital arm of the government. And we are in the process of building and formulating laws and regulations which affect the entire community at large. So we have to be in constant understanding of what is going on in the world and also be aware of the citizens and the issues that they face. And all this is while taking care of the government's needs and what the government wants to do to the people. So this is a very interesting aspect of looking at the cyberbullying, because in my line of work, I have actually been part of formulating many laws and regulations. I have been guided on the data protection laws and also the cybersecurity laws. So when we are formulating the laws and regulations, what most of us don't understand is how exactly we are going to implement these things. Because there are always laws and regulations that are in place. But when it comes to implementation, what we see that is lacking in Sri Lanka is the implementation. Because for some reason, there are laws in place and it is not exactly being brought into light. So when we are especially looking at the pandemic, we have all been through the ups and downs of the pandemic. It was not a very interesting experience, even though we tried to make the best out of the situation. We have all been locked inside our houses and we were not able to go outside, or we were not able to meet our friends, and the laptops and mobile phones became our best friends. And what we did not realize was that it was so good at being a good servant. The digital world was becoming such a good servant for us. It was a blessing in disguise, because this is exactly what we all wanted, because even the ICT industry and the entire world was moving along with the latest technology, but Sri Lanka was lagging behind. Even the simplest laws such as Electronic Transactions Act was not properly being implemented simply because of the attitudes and the mindset of people who were reluctant to go towards the digital age and to accept it. But the pandemic came as a blessing in disguise, and it was absolutely a good servant. But many of us did not realize at that point was that it was also a bad master. Because what we should always understand is that technology, information and communication technology is something that we should be able to control and use to our advantage, and not let that control us in turn. So especially when we are focusing on the technology advancement that we see in the world, what we are seeing right now, especially during the pandemic, is that the young adults and children are privy to the dark side of the web. So the parents and the elder generation, even they reluctantly had to get used to this new technology, because I personally, in my household, I had to teach my mother how to log on to Zoom, and I was doing my work while making sure that she had her microphone on and she had her the background in place. So it was a struggle from in all ages, even from the parents to the children, when the parents were managing working from home and also while attending to the children who had to be present for their online classes. It was a struggle altogether. But the most interesting aspect, I would say, in this scenario is the fact that even though the adults were less technologically, they are not quite technology savvy. Like there is a certain age group who has not had the same exposure as the young adults would have. Because if you look at the past 10 years or so, the advancement of technology is unbelievable, because it has grown in such a rapid space. Because being a 90s kid, I sometimes can't relate to the 20-year-olds who are technologically, savvy and are very conversant with the internet lingo and TikTok and Instagram and so on. But that gap is more, it's greater when it comes to us and our parents. So even though they are quite old and they are more experienced, internet is something that is taken all of us by surprise. So even though we can talk about the children being more privy to the dangers of the internet, it is actually quite similar with the adults as well, because even the parents nowadays are finding it a very novel experience and a novel challenge to deal with the pressure the children are going through, and even they don't understand exactly what they should do, and especially when it comes to cyberbullying. Because see, if I start from where Shakya stopped her speech, she was talking about the bullying that happened in the physical world. We have often seen that there are bullying that happen inside schools, inside the four walls of the school, which even the teachers are not very much aware of. And when it comes to the universities, there are plenty of ragging and harassment that goes on. And of course, there are laws and regulations. Now, if you look at the ragging that happens in universities, there is an act to prohibit ragging and disregard other forms of violence in educational institutions. But they are all talking about physical harassment. And even if you look at the legal provisions in the penal code, they all talk about sexual harassment. But again, it talks about the sexual harassment which happens in the physical world. Nobody is actually talking about what happens in the cyber world. Because if you see, when you talk about bullying per se, it does happen in the physical world, and it is a traumatizing experience. Because I think wherever we have been as children, we have all gone through a certain phase of bullying, no matter how serious it is. It could be a very minor thing, maybe like being pushed from another colleague of ours, or else being named, there could be name calling. We have all been through that, and by no means we can compare the situations and say, okay, this is something small, this is minute, and maybe this is the bigger thing, this is what we should be worrying about. But if I would draw a parallel and say what is more serious about cyberbullying is that it is out there in the world to see. Everyone can see what a horrible thing that you're going through, and unfortunately nobody is there to stop it. So if we move on to the psychological aspect, I mean, I'm not an expert on that. My expertise in the legal arena, but from what I have understood while being a victim of the lockdown and the pandemic altogether, is the fact that we have all had emotions and pressures that are bottled up inside. Even when we are working from home, there was a time when we would spend time on our way to work. And when we are coming back, there would be a certain time that is spent on the road, and we would go and, meet our friends. imagine how difficult it must be for children, because they do not even have that independence of stepping out. Because as adults, we always had the liberty to go out and have a drink or just chill with friends. We can meet whoever we want. Even while we are working, we could just pick up the phone and call. But the children are always guarded by the parents, and without their permission, they are not even supposed to go outside. So whatever happens, it has to be within the frame of their houses, and they are stuck in the digital screen that they would see from morning to evenings, sometimes even at midnight. I have seen my neighbor kids and the struggles the parents go through and the pressure that they face. There are more than, like Shakya mentioned earlier, there have been so many incidents where cyberbullying has taken place, especially because the comments and the sharing that happens, even if you share something quite small, still the others feel that they, maybe because they don't have the luxury to go to do what the other person can do, or else maybe they don't even have the freedom to do that. Let's say somebody, like in that video, somebody was posting about the weight loss journey. Maybe another kid wanted to do that but did not have the courage to do that, and they take out that pressure by not exactly following a weight loss regime on your own, but actually trying to bring that person down. It happens in real life. It happens, the bullying, the name calling, it is so common, but it is much worse in the cyberspace. And when it comes to the laws and regulations, there are actually, in Sri Lanka, you have the relevant laws and regulations in place. If you talk about the Computer Crimes Act, there are provisions which talks about misinterpretation and illegal interception of data. So if you extract data from a computer or internet, and if you distribute it in an unfair or unfair manner without the permission of that person, then that will constitute for an offense. But how many of those cases actually reach the implementation stage is something that we should be thinking about. Because here, most of the time we are talking about children who are underage. Most of the parents don't want to face the stigma of, taking the child to the police station, filing a complaint, and they think that it will be more traumatizing for the child to go through that entire experience. But what they do not understand is that there are laws and regulations in place, and there are things that we can do to protect ourselves. Because what we need to understand is that whatever we do and whatever we do on the cyberspace, it's all being recorded. Everyone can see that. And the technology has advanced in such a way that it is not untraceable, because you actually start to think that maybe you can hide behind an anonymous fake account. You can just you can, come up with a random name and say something very nasty about a person, or just, open Facebook pages and extract pictures that were shared and, just defame somebody else. But what you do not understand is it can be traceable, and there are institutions that will help you and protect you to protect yourself. And especially if you look at the cybercrime division of the Sri Lanka Police, they are always out with a helping hand. You can always go to them. And also there is Sri Lanka CERT, that is the Computer Emergency Readiness Team, who is always willing and ready to help you with any of the cyber threats and issues that are coming up. So the help is out there, but you also have to, think about how you can protect yourself. You have to be mindful of what you post on social media platforms, and always make sure that your passwords are protected. I mean, these are things that the children are more aware of these days than adults because they are more privy to the dangers, and at a very young age they learn to protect themselves. But having said that, internet is also a very dangerous place and we should understand the repercussions of it. But from a legal perspective, I would also like to say that the help is out there and it's all yours to take it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanushi. I think you raised an important point, especially when it comes to the remedies that are available to children, that even though those mechanisms are there, I think Sri Lanka has, unfortunately, what we call a shame culture, right? So we don't talk about things publicly if it will bring shame to the family. And so very often children are a victim of that. And so I suppose the challenge is really to be able to, while you try to break that culture, is to also communicate that these systems are in place and to convince people that there are places that you can trust to go for help, places that will deal with things sensitively. Just one story or one rumor about someone who had a bad experience when trying to come forward, I think is enough to break anyone's courage to come forward and sort of make use of these provisions. So we now turn to the final speaker with us, Christy, who's going to talk to us about social media addiction. I want to share an anecdote that we were working with a group of young people, and I just polled what their screen time was. And one of them had 16 hours of screen time on their phone for a particular day. And so when I was sort of expressed my shock at that, his response was that 16 hours of screen time is good because it means that he was getting 8 hours of sleep. So Christy is going to talk to us about social media addiction. He holds MD honors from Vitebsk State Medical University in Belarus, and is at the beginning of his career as a medical practitioner in Sri Lanka. He's also a co-founder of the Digital Wellbeing Initiative, and his prior experience includes working as a program coordinator at Sri Lanka Unites, involved in projects promoting reconciliation, improving youth employability, and combating public harassment of women in Sri Lanka. In his free time, he also dabbles in creative writing, including short stories and poetry. So Christy, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjit, for that introduction, and I also thank the Arts Festival for having me on this panel, and also for putting together such a amazing display of artwork and skills. So I know that I have been kind of introduced as a medical person, but I think the real perspective that I bring to the panel, and also I brought to our project as I was part of the Reconnect Us project as well, is that of someone who has struggled with digital addiction myself. I mean, it's not just struggle, but continue to struggle with digital addiction, right? And that is really the perspective that I bring. And so in my opening remarks, I would like to talk a little bit about what I mean by digital addiction, and a little bit about the biology behind it, and also about how some technology is developed by tech companies to really hijack this biology that kind of causes us to be addicted to our digital devices. And then I would also, like, as a panelist who was also part of the Reconnect Us project, I would like to go into a little bit of detail about some of the findings that we had in our project as well. So why do we call it digital addiction, right? Because addiction is essentially, we use that word is generally used when, we talk about like substances and, things that, I mean, when you think about digital addiction, like, does it really warrant the use of the word addiction, right? And that was something that I've also like really thought about, because one of the key features of addiction is that it interferes with your day-to-day life. But sometimes when we use our digital devices, we are completely functional. So why do we really call this addiction, right? This was something that even I found really hard to think about, because if you're functional, like, what's the big deal? But one thing that I personally realized in my personal journey was, until you really stop using a certain platform, or until you stop using your digital devices, you don't really realize how much of control these devices have over you, right? And some of these feelings that you get when you stop using your digital devices. I don't know if any of you all have like experimented with like, you know, getting off social media for extensive period of time, but like when you actually do that, you know, kind of have these feelings that are very similar to substance withdrawals, right? Like where you know, feel dysphoric and you kind of, you know, have mood swings, you feel really bored. And so these kind of hint at the fact that, you know, it is actually a form of addiction. And so going into a little bit about the biology behind why this happens, right? So essentially, we have this cycle in our brains called the dopamine cycle, or also known as the reward cycle. So what really happens there is, so dopamine is this substance in our body that's produced in our brains, which kind of is responsible for our sensations of pleasure. So when you achieve something in life, you do something and you succeed, you feel elated and you feel euphoric. And this is basically this compound, dopamine flooding your brains. So I think Malin in his artist speech also kind of spoke about this. So what really happens there is you try to, actually dopamine, the dopamine cycle is a very important aspect of your biology, right? Because you need it to be motivated. You need it to actually, you know, do things. So for example, to study and then, you know, pass your exam. So you need to push yourself and you study. So that's a period of like dopamine hunger. And then you actually succeed, you pass your exam, and then you feel happy. And that is dopamine flooding your brain. So this cyclical process of, you know, dopamine hunger and then the reward, or, you know, hard work and reward, right? This cycle is very important to our physiology. So what really happens with substance abuse, and also with similar to what's happening in social media, is social media gives you this easy fix, right? It kind of short circuits this cycle, where it kind of gives you this dopamine hit consistently. So every time you look at a post, every time you click something, every time you know, scroll on your news feed, you are constantly getting a hit of dopamine. And so what this really does is it short circuits the whole cycle. And so as a result, you don't really have the motivation to go and, you know, do something. For example, reading a book, right? Reading a book takes a lot of effort. And the kind of gratification you get from reading a book is through those, it's sort of a form of delayed gratification, right? You read through a chapter and sometimes you might come to the climax and you feel a sense of like, you know, excitement. But when you have social media where you keep getting dopamine hits all the time, to actually go back and, you know, read a book feels like, you know, boring, or feels like, you know, something that you don't really want to do. So the one thing that I noticed even through some of these artwork that we saw today is that, you know, this experience of being hooked onto our devices is quite a universal experience, right? It's, I think even Leith kind of referred to it about this particular person wanting to, you know, reply to their friends, and then taking the phone to actually, you know, reply to the friend, and then getting distracted by, you know, YouTube videos, or even in our addiction PSA, right? You go and you want to do exercises, or you want to like study, and you sit down to do it, and then all it takes is like one notification on your phone, and then you don't realize where the next 45 minutes goes because you've been scrolling on your. So that really raises the question of, you know, how much in control of our behavior we really have, right? Because it's easy to say, you know, you need to control your screen time, but it's a really hard process to do. And there's a reason why this is so, right? Because these, like I think Malin referred to this in his speech as well. The reason why it's so hard for us to do this is because these platforms are custom built to exploit our dopamine cycle, right? So I think even in the PSA videos that we worked on, one of the things that we consistently highlighted, in fact, we had 2 characters who appeared in a few of our videos that's, you know, representative of social media platforms. You know, creepily staying there and like watching everything that's going on, because these social media platforms are really kind of the culprits when it comes to a lot of these problems that we've spoken about today, especially digital addiction, because they have invested millions of dollars into psychological research to find out how our brains work, and they have actually exploited this mechanism. So, for example, an example would be the infinite scroll, right? So, were we ever asked whether we needed something called an infinite scroll, right? Or this constant bombardment of like information which is limitless. Like you can scroll on and on your device, and we were never asked whether we wanted it, and it was just given to us. And most of these, like if any of you all have watched this documentary that came out last year, right, Social Dilemma, they kind of cover a lot of these, and I would encourage to go and watch that documentary, because they kind of highlight a lot of these issues. And so one of the issues that they talk about is even refreshing your home page. That entire process of pulling down your home page and refreshing is built based on how slot machines work in casinos, right? So these kind of like malevolent ways of hijacking our brains is sort of the main reason why we don't have this control over our digital use. So what can we really do about it? So there are a bunch of things that we can do about it, but one thing that we thought that we really should do is talk about it, right? Because it's very rarely spoken about. I mean, there was some conversation after the documentary came out, but we thought that we wanted to, get together with some children, because they have to deal with a lot of these issues, especially with like, online schooling and having to spend so much time on their digital devices. So we wanted to like listen to some of the ideas that the younger generation has. And in fact, working with this group of child artists was very rewarding. And it was also a learning experience, I would say, for me, and also a challenge in the sense that I was personally challenged to, control my own screen time, because, now you're working with children and like, you are telling them to control their screen time, so you better be, cognizant of your own screen time. And I felt like that kind of helped me, keep my screen time in control as well. And so one thing that we observed by working with the child artists was most of them kind of realized that there's something wrong. That most of them realized that things are not normal. Like they are spending way too much time on their devices, and they also said that a lot of their parents were concerned about the amount of time that they spent on their devices. But also, in addition to that, they also observed that their parents also spent a lot of time on their digital devices, and so this problem, like I said, is a universal problem, right? And sometimes it takes a lot for us to admit that we are powerless, or to admit that we do have a problem with the amount of time we spend on our digital devices. And in fact, it's easy for us to think that we are in control, but we really aren't in control as much as we think, because as I have explained through how our biology works, right? So I think it's important to admit to the amount of time we spend, and I think a good way to do it is to externalize the way we measure our screen time. So, screen time monitors, or even like, listen to other people, and, if someone tells you that, you're spending too much time on your phone, like, those kind of external assessment of the amount of time you spend is the way to go, because we are a really bad judge of how much we are hooked onto our devices. At least that's what I found in my personal experience as well. So I think moving forward, one of the important things is to admit to ourselves. And also I think, I don't know, maybe in the future, social media platforms and digital tech companies might grow a conscience. That's something that we can all hope for. But I think one thing that really helps is to communicate with each other, and that's another aspect that really helped us during our program, was to, share each other's screen times. And I think Malin mentioned this as well, and it's sort of like a peer support group. And I think openly talking about it and openly, admitting that, there are obviously going to be times that you fail. like a week where, your screen time just skyrockets. But then always you need to be able to come back and say, okay, I need to get back and, try to control the amount of time I'm spending. So yeah, it's a difficult issue, and I think in a lot of ways we are powerless. But I also think that together we can combat this. And this experience of working with children has been an amazing experience. So yeah, that's kind of what I want to start with.
Thank you for those comments, Chris. When you mentioned about social media and the way they try to keep you hooked, I recall particularly, when you're on Facebook on your PC and you've checked all your notifications, if you log out, your image automatically appears with a notification just as you log out, sort of as if, on the instant you logged out, something else happened that you would want to go back and see. I think that's just one of the gimmicks that they use. Before we move into maybe a round of questions just between some of the panelists, I would like to remind our audience online that you can pose questions either to a specific panelist or to the panel in general on either the YouTube or FB chats, or if you are on the Zoom link, you can post questions on the Zoom link. This panel will only be enriched by the questions that you have. Please feel free to challenge any of the panelists, to disagree with something that we've said, and we'll try to do our best to incorporate that. But going forward, one of the things that the pandemic has brought out and that came out especially in Enceleta's piece was this idea of spaces, right? Different spaces. So she talks about small boxes, that we are now trapped in small boxes that are on our screens or our phone screens or our laptops, whereas we used to have different spaces. So maybe this question is both to Krishit and then maybe to Shakya. So to Krishit, I would ask, in your experience, does this change from our natural way of life, where we had natural breaks, in a sense, because of the way we lived in terms of moving between school and other things, whereas now we are all of that happens in one space. Whether that has had an impact in your opinion on the way children have to deal with addiction and children have to deal with having to constantly be online. And Shakya, maybe on the issue of cyberbullying, this idea of a break from the bully. So when you think about physical bullying, when you leave school, you leave the bully behind. But when it happens online, in that online space, the bully really is in your pocket, right? So maybe in reflecting on this aspect of spaces and breaks, maybe we can hear a little first from Krishit and then from Shakya.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjit, for that question. And definitely, right? So one of the biggest differences that has happened because of the lockdown, especially when it comes to, it's not just something that applies to children, but also to us as adults as well, right? The way we function has completely changed. For instance, you have a Zoom meeting. If it's a physical meeting, you would go from, one meeting to the other meeting. There might be a short, travel time, or or you might even have a short break. But when you have Zoom meetings, one of the things that you tend to do is if someone says there's a meeting at 6:30 to 8:30, and then there's another meeting at 8:30 to 10:30, you say yes to both. And so essentially what's happening is you're on front of your device right throughout. And these breaks between the amount of time that you're spending on those devices, right? Those natural breaks are kind of lost. And the importance of those breaks is that, I think Shakya also spoke about Zoom fatigue, right? And that's an actual phenomenon, and there's a lot of research that's going on to it. And these are things that are just coming up, and there's a lot more. It's very new topics in science, and that's being researched, but it's an actual phenomenon. And so we need to be cognizant of this, and we need to try and schedule in a lot of off-screen time into our daily lives, because otherwise it's very easy to practically wake up and spend the entire day in front of a screen. And I mean, there's multiple screens, right? You spend time on your laptop and then on your phone. And sometimes you tend to view using your phone as taking a break from your work, but then you're still looking at a screen. So, and yeah, so I think it's very important that we, schedule in off-screen activities. I mean, just going out and maybe playing with your pet, or just going and, having a actual conversation with someone in your house as opposed to texting or, using a virtual medium. So I think these are very important aspects as well. So yeah.
Picking up from where Christian left, I think it's very true. There's hardly any boundary when it comes to online, because the fact that you are now confined to a space, and a space that essentially you're in control of, means that even if you have a meeting sometimes at 9 in the night, you take it, because you don't have to travel to places. It's just a matter of clicking a button and joining a meeting via Zoom. And this is true even in the case of cyberbullying as well, because like you mentioned, when you're in school, if you get bullied, you leave school, and hopefully, and sometimes as well, that situation is behind you. You have come past that stage of bullying. But cyberbullying is often always there around you, because it's social media and news travels fast and it's constantly in your face. You will, and unlike in school where the bully will probably only bully you when you're in your classroom or during your lunch break, this can happen at any point in time of the day, at any given occasion. And that being said, it is very difficult in that sense to deal with cyberbullying. Bullying in general is a very difficult phenomena and a situation for any young adult or child for that matter to go through. But cyberbullying adds to it by not giving you a break. And the sad reality, I think, is this is something we have to come to terms with. Those boundaries, unfortunately, are a little blurry since we are in the digital world now and we've adapted to this new world where everything is online. So in the case of a bully, where if you're being cyberbullied and you need a break, for one, there's the option of blocking the person, but sometimes that option doesn't work. Since information is out there, they'll probably find a new way of getting in contact with you and bullying you. And this is where I think in one of our videos, PSA videos, we also stressed on how a person feels extremely lonely during this time. And as Insulator pointed out, you feel trapped. And that is precisely what you feel when you're cyberbullied. You're trapped. You don't know where to turn because you don't have a break or the time to even think for yourself, which is when talking to people comes in handy. And this is where I think we can bring in our parents. Oftentimes, we are very reluctant to talk to the people closest to us. But it is now more than ever that we need to talk to them. Because I find that if you are going through a rough patch, there's always the possibility of an adult being able to support you. And our world is such that we have grown and we have come to recognize these problems, that solutions are available, as we discussed. And in that sense, I think the youth, for what we need to do as youth, is to take that opportunity, take the help, and of course, always facilitate a conversation and talk to people about this. But interestingly, what I think we can also do as young adults is when we feel that we don't have enough space and we don't really know what to do, this is also when the fact that you have your own space can come into handy. Insulator pointed about art journaling or journaling in general. You can use these methods to vent out your frustrations and find your own coping mechanism to the problem at hand. Take a little bit of time, watch a TED Talk, enrich your mind on methods in which you as an individual can cope with the solutions. And I think we're smart, even though we're young adults. So we can come up with our answers, provided we are active seekers of solutions for the problems. And we are now in our space. So we can use the fact that we have that tiny space, that we are in our tiny box, to our advantage. So I think there's a lot that we can do, despite it being difficult. We just have to be willing to look for the solutions and get the help that's available.
Thanks, Shakya. I want to now bring in some of the artists as well who are with us online, and maybe just to pick up from where Shakya left off, Tasmin and her performance Chatroom 2021 is premiering later tonight. So I wonder if you can add a little more about sort of what inspired your display on cyberbullying, and what are some of the insights that helped shape the artwork that you produced as it pertains to cyberbullying.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Sanjit. Going off what Shakya said, actually, it was inspired by a very similar idea. Initially, because when I started working on Chatroom a few years ago, what inspired it was the idea that you are essentially walking around, if you are being cyberbullied, you are walking around with your bully in your pocket. And it's not that you can just leave it aside and take that break. Sometimes he or she is coming back into your safe space, into your homes. And when over these last 2 years, we went into lockdown, and as Shakya noted earlier, the cases of cyberbullying have skyrocketed since the pandemic started. And that's not necessarily because the people who are doing it are evil people or bad people. It's sometimes simply because they're just frustrated and they're bored. And they don't, most importantly, they don't realize what they're doing. They don't realize that what they're doing actually has an effect on the other person. So that kind of led into this whole thing where we started experimenting and we started talking about, you know, what happens when you're inside and you are using the internet and social media and Zoom as your only means of connecting with people outside. And then you have somebody who you can't see and you have no idea who they are, but somehow they seem to be saying very hurtful things and very mean things to you based off of something that you put up on social media to express yourself, or anywhere really. And maybe it could even be just a chat room, or an app like Omega, where you go on and where you are going on anonymously because you want to share something personal about yourself, because you as a person do not necessarily have that space or that person to talk about the things that you want to. And unfortunately, you're paired against someone who doesn't really empathize with you and who doesn't see you as somebody with feelings. And they take what you give them as, well, material for them, basically to make a joke, to entertain themselves, or even just because in a very twisted way, they connect with you and they want to see if you would go to the extent that they themselves would not go. Yeah. So that is kind of the premise that we took on this version of Chatroom.
Thanks. Yeah. I think I read about this as well, that it's that absence of the normal social cues that govern behavior, or that formulate our behavior when we interact in person. So it was talking about how when a child says something hurtful to another child, they see the physical reaction in terms of the tears or the hurt in their face, and that gives them some kind of feedback in terms of, you know, what it is. Whereas if you post a comment and then just put your phone back in your pocket, you know, the effect is much later, which is when the person sees it, and you don't get that feedback about what happens as well. I want to go next to Malin and return to this issue of misinformation. So it's a two-parter, right? So I would say the first question is, in your work with the child artists in Reconnect Us, in your experience, is filtering out misinformation a bigger problem for children than it is for adults? On the one hand, children are, what they call digital natives. They are more familiar with online, with the online world, but because of their immaturity, they may be more naive than their parents. So in your experience, what was your sense of what those children got? That's the first one. And the second one, of course, is Mahisha talked about this idea of the rapid spread of misinformation. And one of the problems with that misinformation is this idea of virality, right? That these algorithms are designed to take the things that are really popular, right? And popularity is, let's say, truth neutral, right? So in the sense that it doesn't really care whether the information is true or not, but if it's getting a lot of traction, it just gets boosted further up on people's feeds and things like that. So how do you see, like, is there a way we can combat virality or guard against that? And what your thoughts are on those two things. So first on the issue of children versus adults, and the second one on virality.
Thank you, Sanjit. So children versus adults, I think there definitely is a generational divide when it comes to misinformation. I would personally, from my experience, say that adults are more susceptible to misinformation purely because, at least the type of misinformation that you find through technology, mainly because they don't, they're not as aware how easy it is to, just slap a logo onto a post or make it look legitimate when it really isn't. Having said that, I think we are still at a huge risk if we don't start talking about it with children and start educating them as well, because the same issue with the older generation, which is just that they haven't talked about this issue. It's not like our adults are like complete idiots, right? It's just that they haven't been exposed to the issue, or they haven't it's just ignorance. It's not purely just stupidity or anything like that. It's just the lack of knowledge or understanding that, of the nature of this technology. So in that sense, I think children have a bit more of an edge. But having said that, unless we also push that understanding onto children and emphasize how dangerous it is and how easy it is to make misinformation, I think we could have another generation also completely lacking that knowledge and skill set to deal with misinformation, which is why I think the work, for example, that Hashtag Generation is doing and other organizations are doing are really important. And I think that's why it's also really important that all these other artists like Tasmin and Chatroom, as well as Insulata, all of them are trying to talk about digital issues pertaining to children, because unless we do talk about it, we can have another generation also completely miss out on the problems. In terms of virality, again, I think the only antidote here is, I think, you look back to things like nutrition, sex education, and even smoking, right? Within a couple of generations, we've seen a huge reduction in these things. You go back into like the 80s or whatever, everyone's smoking, right? Like you watch, but now it's not that smoking has disappeared, but just talking about the dangers of it, educating people about it has drastically, like there statistics to back this up, drastically reduced the number of smokers. And I think we need to do a very similar thing when it comes to these issues. And that's the only way really that we can combat them, because we can't expect governments to keep up. They are extremely slow in policy making. I hope they do, right? But the pace at which technology is going is so fast that it's left governments behind, it's left our family members behind, and unfortunately our education systems behind as well in dealing with it. So the more we try to get those systems to catch up, the quicker we can deal with issues like virality and the ease at which misinformation is spreading. And I honestly am hopeful that, within a couple of generations at least, that we can, I don't think it's going to go away. Misinformation is an issue that will always exist. But I feel like if we do start talking about it and tackling it, we can deal with it, which is why it's amazing to see all these artists. And I urge everyone to watch Chatroom and I think it's at 7 o'clock if I'm not mistaken, and all the other performances from all the other artists here. There were also performances yesterday talking a lot about digital issues, because there was a session yesterday on online schooling, for example, which you can go back and watch on Teja's YouTube. Lead's performance, for example, was also talking a lot about most of these issues and how it's like to be a teenager during this time. So I think this kind of conversation is what we need, and the more we have this, I think as time goes by, things will get better. I hope. And so all I can say is, like, everyone here, I hope we can just continue this conversation, just like not and go beyond just this panel and bring it to our homes, bring it to our parents as well as our friends. And yeah.
Thanks, Malin. I want to bring in Insuleta and Leith. I think they're both with us. I think both of your pieces talked about this idea of physical touch, which is another aspect, right? So one of the things we looked at already was this idea of being boxed in and being separated from others. But your pieces and in your comments, you also talked about not having that aspect of physical touch, about being able to interact in person. So, I mean, I'm just throwing this out to the two of you. Maybe each of you can share, what aspects of, being in actual close physical proximity to people, was it that you felt the deprivation of most, right? What were the things that you really missed most about close proximity, about, hugs, high fives, slaps on the back, that kind of thing? What did each of you feel the deprivation of most? We can start with Insuleta first, maybe, and then move on to Leith.
Okay, so there's a lot I can say. And like when we were doing everything online, like we couldn't understand, like I think one of the panelists mentioned that like when you're saying a comment on a social media, it's just a comment. So no one really understands your feelings, or they don't really see your emotions, and they don't know what you're going through. So when you're there with someone physically, you literally can see that. And also, like you said about the hugs, how we literally are with each other, we eat together, we sing together, and all of those things. So we had none of that when we had everything online.
Leith?
Well, if I'm being completely honest, I'm a bit of an introvert. I don't know if I am. I don't know. So, and I kind of enjoyed the lockdown and being away from people. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, to an extent, I did enjoy it. But I think a lot of introverts that I interviewed actually also talked about how they kind of changed from being introverts, and they kind of started appreciating people and gatherings and interactions with social interactions basically. So I guess it's just, I don't know what exactly it is about social interactions that we really that make us feel whole, but yeah, I think it's just having people see you when you're in a social, when you're interacting with people physically. I think you feel much more seen than you would through a screen. And everything through screen, it doesn't really feel real. I don't think humans have evolved to that point as of yet to actually feel real
Connection, yeah.
energy through the screen. So yeah.
Thanks, yeah. I want to maybe throw this to Chris as well, because I think there's something about physical touch that also contributes to our neurochemical reaction as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so when it comes to our feelings of happiness, right? So I need to add in the caveat here that I'm not really a behavioral psychologist, or I don't really have that expertise. But from what I know, like there are 4 chemicals that really control how we experience happiness. And so dopamine is obviously one, which I already described. But then there is oxytocin, serotonin, as well as endorphins. And there are different, these are responsible for like different feelings of happiness. So oxytocin is what's really responsible for like interpersonal happiness. So when you interact with someone, when you hug someone, or you have feelings of affection towards someone, all of those are controlled by oxytocin. And then you have endorphins, which are also like pleasure hormones that you can get by pushing yourself to extremes like exercising, and those are also related to pleasure. So I think it's important for our healthy well-being to maintain a healthy balance between these different types of ways of feeling pleasure, rather than completely sticking to our screens, which only works through one mechanism. Yeah.
Thanks. So we've got some questions or comments in Q&A. One of them is sort of responding to what Tanushi said. So this is in relation to the ability of government institutions that are available to help in the cyber crime space. Question is a little pointed. So it's, have you had any experience in the process of making a complaint and the response and what that entails? The comment is that it is so archaic that by the time they respond to a complaint, the damage is done. That there is theory, but sometimes a lack of understanding in reality. If you want to respond in any way, but I understand, where the sentiment might be coming from. Do you know if there are any programs in place? I think I saw a handbook that was prepared to sensitize the police to deal with these kinds of complaints. Do you know if there are any other initiatives underway to train more police officers or things like that?
Actually, I do understand where this is coming from, because even from our experience, what we have seen, especially like forget cyberbullying or any other cyber harassment, even if it is just the basic amount of technology related education or handling any tech related incidents, it's always quite we can say that the tech savviness of police officers and the government agents and everyone else in between is quite less, unfortunately, because like I said earlier, even during my introductory session, that it is with the pandemic that people are now actively embracing the technology, and now only they are becoming familiar with how to use the technology and to properly understand where this is coming from. So even though there is a cybercrime division and there are the Sri Lanka CERT who are there to help people out, especially in relation to these cybercrimes, still when it comes to filing a complaint, the lack of understanding and the empathy is something that people face from the government employees. I'm not trying to be I'm not saying this in a bad sense, but I'm strictly speaking of the reality that is there in the world, in Sri Lanka, especially when it comes to the urban sector, the urban scenario. There are more understanding and empathetic officers who are willing to deal with them with a sense of understanding, and they are quite, they understand the relevance and the importance of keeping the things confidential and why this has become an issue. But when we move out of Colombo and when we move out of the urban areas towards the villages, we do not have the same luxury, because there are so many people who are in the villages and the children who are going through severe issues, but they do not have any resource persons or any adults or anyone to go and get advice from. So from the legal aspect, the Bar Association of Sri Lanka has taken some steps. They are conducting these legal camps which can be extended. I mean, not specifically in relation to cybercrimes, but in general, like they go out to the villages, they spread awareness, and they open space for people to come and talk to them and obtain legal advice device. So those platforms are there, but the unfortunate incident is that Sri Lanka is still moving at a very, very slow pace, and there is only so much that the lawmakers and the policymakers can do to effect that. And it's all about the implementation and the change of mindset that needs to be progressive, which is something that we are all very much looking forward to. But from the policy aspect, we have moved, we are actually in a much better place than we were earlier, especially when it comes to, we are one of the first few signatories of the Budapest Convention, which was actually the main piece of legislation which resulted in the Computer Crimes Act. So it has been here in Sri Lanka as a South Asian country more than any other countries in the region. But if the implementation, but even though the act has been there and still people are struggling to, you know, get anywhere forward with it, then there is something really serious in the implementation. So that is something that we need to focus on.
Thanks. Yeah. So, as I anticipated, the addiction seems to be a question that a lot of people will want to raise questions about. We have a question in general about, the question is, do you think it's wise to have a habit of taking a regular hiatus from social media for long periods of time to condition oneself from being addicted to social media? Or do you think that may not be healthy in the long run and therefore one should try to control one's addiction step by step on a daily basis? And there seems to be a sort of general question posed to Marlene. In a very serious case of addiction, for example, game addiction, that is at a chronic level, what are some steps parents can take? So you know which end of the age spectrum that question is coming from. Maybe Marlene can respond first, and then we can sort of try to respond to the first question. So I know in China, I think, was it in China or one of these other countries, there was a ban recently, or they tried to crack down on online gaming because it had reached, in their minds, a sort of dangerous level. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so in cases of really, really serious addiction, this is, as Chris pointed out, where you can't function as a regular or participate in society in a regular manner. Like if it's dysfunctional and it's really affecting your life, I think the best thing to do is seek professional help, especially for your child. So this could be counseling, therapy, because I think like in that end of the spectrum, if it's really serious, I think there's really no alternative other than that. If it is somewhere in between, and this again is a very subjective thing, like how do you judge what level your kid is at, right? So unfortunately, since I don't know the questionnaires, the questionnaires child, or like haven't met them, it's really hard for me to answer. So I'll just try my best to answer in as generic as possible. If you're at a lower end of the spectrum or middle of the spectrum, I think in terms of addiction, I think the best thing to do is try and get the child to understand how debilitating it is, how much they're missing out on. And then, as Christy pointed out, just basic steps like tracking your screen time so that they themselves realize what the problem is. So again, it comes down to communication and trying, and all of us rallying around this issue, right? Everyone from our education systems to policymakers to parents to artists talking about it, and beyond that, and these are the traditional ways, right, that we reach people in society when it comes to issues. So these traditional systems still exist, and they just need to, pick up the pace because these technologies are moving fast. Which is why I think everyone needs to get engaged with the world of technology. So I guess my answer is really first try and gauge at which level your child is having this problem. If it's really serious, if it's a point where he's spending hours on end in the room and not eating or not engaging in schoolwork or anything like that, then I think it's best to take serious measures. And if it's anywhere below that spectrum, I think talking to them and trying to understand them, just like you try to understand any other issue your child is going through, and just engage in basic parental guidance is, I think, the best way to go forward.
Okay, on breaks from social media, maybe we can have Mahisha and Shakya weighing in on, well, maybe our own experiences. Actually, Marlene and I had this debate when we were introducing the children in the Reconnect Us project to Discord. My position was that, if one of the basic things we are recognizing is that human beings are bad at dealing with new technologies and resisting addiction, then surely one of the mechanisms is to, avoid the temptation entirely, right? So think twice about joining a new platform. Whereas Marlene was saying, well, in the end, it wasn't an issue because everyone happened to be on that platform. This is Discord. Almost everyone was on the platform to begin with. But there is that tension between, do we trust ourselves to be able to use it well, or do we acknowledge our limitations and say, let's just not try to play with fire, so to speak. So maybe Mahisha first, what do you think about what they call social media cleanses, so to speak? Yeah.
Sure, thanks for that, Sanjit. So like Marlene said, I think I'll sort of build upon what Marlene said about trying to understand where you are on that spectrum, sort of at least a self-assessment of how addicted you are. And maybe adding on to what Chris did said, the first step is also to get that external assessment, right? So first to understand that. And also I think, like many other things, I think even the social media detox phase, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. So I think the first step is to experiment with what works for you, how you feel, and maybe even document or journal some of the different things that you tried and try to see what works best for you. So like for example, it could be an assessment, and you can try to, and like there are apps that obviously record your screen time, so to try and evaluate and try to keep your screen time low, then try to take intermittent breaks and really see how you feel and assess out of each kind of activity or detox or cleanse that you do. So I think it really then boils down to what works for you as an individual. But I think there's a lot of strategies, and there's a lot of options of detox and cleanse out there. I myself have tried a few. One works, one doesn't. As an organization that works very closely on social media, there's a requirement for me to sort of actively be present there and consume that much of information. But not necessarily am I an active user of it. So like my personal accounts are not necessarily the most active. So I myself have consciously tried to implement a few things and have figured out maybe what works best for me. So just to add that, and I think if there is a little bit of time, I'd like to build on to the first question that was sort of posed to Tanushi. So as part of #Generations work, because we sort of work closely with social media intermediaries and Facebook also, there's a lot of young children, and there's a lot of people who come to us in requesting technical assistance, especially when their photos are leaked or there are imposter accounts created, fake accounts created in their names. And most often than not, you see that all of these are children. Most often than not, you see them, they're all under 18. And two things that I'd like to address in this, right? One is in responding to the question about what are the remedies that are available? Are those systems efficient? What is the experience? Like Tanushi mentioned, there are systems in place, but in our personal experiences, the systems could be far more efficient. So say state institutions that are dealing with cyber, if you send an email complaint, you absolutely have no response. So first you need to be savvy with the platform if you're going to savvy with the technology, if you're going to sort of address these digital harms or this digital violence. So I think there's a lot of capacity building, skill building, institutional strengthening that needs to go on at these state institutions if you are to take on the first step of even receiving a complaint. So most often than not, then we resort to actually physically being present and visiting them physically to make these complaints. And another challenge that we have faced is the cybercrimes division. I think, at least in my knowledge, for those complaints, you have to be, it's sort of headquartered in Colombo. So then what happens to access, especially in this lockdown, what happens to access for all those others who are living outside of Colombo, who do not have that privilege to access them, right? So are we looking at alternative mechanisms? Are we looking at systems and processes to be built in place to, because like Shakya said, there is the increase in the cyberbullying cases are becoming really rampant. So what are the remedies and what are the systems that we're trying to bring in place to sort of address those? So that sort of, and also then implementation. So access is one problem, then the implementation of it. Yeah, like most often than not, okay, the general attitude that it is received is, okay, so what if your pictures are leaked? Why did you send them? Victim blaming, right? Why did you share that with them in the first place? So a lot of, and most often than not, I'll come to this a little later, the children usually who kind of come to us for support, they come through their friends. It's directed through somebody who's really not their family. So they're obviously not sharing it with their family, and they're trying to take these alternative routes and mechanisms to reach us, to first take it down and really see what their options are. So I don't think there's also, even in civil society, I don't think there's enough support that is publicly available to children when they face such issues. So slowly it's increasing, that like the number of complaints that we receive are sort of increasing. It's not a good thing, but we're happy that we're receiving, because we know that there's a lot more people that we're actually not able to reach and support. So we're actually happy that they're coming to us for support, so that at least the first few steps of technical assistance we're able to give them, and then let them know what their options are. So that being said, that's sort of like access is a problem, implementation is a problem. And then the second part of it is them not disclosing it to their parents, right? So I think another challenge or another problem is that disconnect, with, especially now children in the lockdown being forced, being continuously trapped, or even consciously being engaged with their devices, by choice or not. The fact that they're not really having close conversations with their parents. Parents need to, in the absence of you being in close proximity with your friends in school and your teachers, and you not having that access, and you being sort of isolated in your homes and in your rooms, I think parents need to play a more active role in sort of becoming friends and talking about these digital issues that might, arise, so that the children then have confidence to confide in the parents, because certain instances have happened in Sri Lanka where the children have suicided just because it's a shame. And like you mentioned, Sanjit, it's the honor code, right? And that's why they don't want to come forward, and that's why they want to sort of evade the knowledge of the parents, and they're like rooted through their friends. So I think that's I think it's a multi-pronged approach for this, sort of to try and find solutions and address this. So I think that's another important thing that we need to work. And maybe we can also work with parents and give opportunities and platforms and have these conversations with parents, and we need to create those spaces as well.
Shakya, I think the original question was about social media, but maybe you can also weigh in after that about, among your friends, how many of them feel comfortable, telling their parents if something has gone wrong, or how many of them just rely on their friends' WhatsApp groups to discuss those things?
Great, thank you for the question. And in response to the first question of taking a break from social media, I think like Mahisha mentioned, it is very subjective. What works for one may not work for another. And maybe you can even pick up a few tips and tricks from your friends as well. But in my opinion, I don't think taking a break from social media and choosing to be silent and take long spells where you don't look at social media or delete it from your phones really addresses the problem of addiction. Because if you are addicted to something, there is bound to be a reason behind it. True, it is either enjoyment or pleasure, or as I mentioned initially, it's down to the fact that you have anxiety and stress, and now this social media has become your coping mechanism, so to say. So in that sense, if you take a break and you completely stay away from it, it will true give you the time and space to explore things, but it doesn't address the root cause of the problem. So in that sense, we need to really look at why is a person addicted. And I think that's one thing we need to teach the youth of today. We often don't take time to really sit back and reflect, because they say ignorance is bliss. So it's far easier to ignore a problem than to really retrospect and understand why you're feeling it. But it is important that we retrospect and figure out why exactly and where this addiction is stemming from, and address that core issue. So if you're, for me personally, when I realized that it was my being anxious and afraid of exams that was leading to binge watching a ton of TV series, I took some time off where I really questioned myself. Why am I afraid of failing? What can I do to not be afraid of failing? And it really was a shift in my perspective to say, true enough, I am feeling anxious about the exam, but what could possibly go wrong? I will fail, and I'll try again. So it's all about your mindset in that sense, understanding the root cause of why you're having that addiction, and then shifting your perspective to something that is far more positive. And in response to the second question of being comfortable with parents, I do see a lot of my friends and even people around me are very uncomfortable with sharing their opinions or their struggles that they face with their parents. And sometimes it's down to the fact that they are afraid of what their parents' response is. Sometimes they feel more comfortable in confiding in a friend because they feel you're on the same plane, that you will understand that problem. And all of that is true and fine. But for me, what I have come to realize is I tend to be a bit of a chatterbox, so I share a lot of things with my parents, from the minute of details. They'd know what is happening in my life. And for me, initially, this was baffling. Why don't you tell your parents? And I think I, in fact, asked my friend once, and I said, I know you're having this problem, and this is my perspective to it, but I really think you should go speak to your parents. And then they'd tell me, Shakya, that's not an option for me. I can't do that. And for me, this couldn't be comprehended. Why can't you talk to your parents? Aren't they your go-to people? So in that sense, I think the parent and child relationship goes both ways. So your parents need to establish a certain level of comfort and show you love and regard, to say you might make a mistake, but even then we still love you no matter what. But at the same time, as children, we are also very rebellious. So we don't give our parents a chance. And we ourselves jump to conclusions and say, hey, they're not going to listen to us, so why even bother? But in reality, they just might listen to you. And there have been those rare occasions where my friends have been like, you know what, I spoke to my parents, and they did help me out. So it's really about both parents and students actively building that relationship, because unless that relationship of trust and love is there, no child is going to want to speak to their parent, and no parent is also going to be able to acknowledge it because they are not getting a good response from their children. So in that sense, I think it's a relationship that goes both ways and something that needs to be continuously worked on.
Yeah, so actually quite a nice segue to our last question, which is from a child, directed to Mahisha. Maybe you can quickly respond to this one. How do we tell our parents about misinformation without offending them? It's harder to tell them about it because they think they are not wrong.
I'll maybe start by sharing a small experience, my personal experience. So post-Easter Sunday attacks, there was obviously lots of WhatsApp forwards going around at that time. And my mom, especially, she'll break news to me like every hour or every couple of hours, because obviously it's coming in WhatsApp groups, right? So I had to sit her down and tell her, look, your sources are not state intelligence. And had to have a constructive conversation with her about getting her to understand what her news sources are. So it's really about sitting them down. Yes, sometimes, like Sanjit, sort of you mentioned from the question that, yeah, people do get offended, but I think it's not about, I think initially, I think my approach was, at least in the past was, don't do those, don't send that, don't hit share, don't forward. And then you obviously are met with like, I don't care attitude, because they don't take it as constructive feedback. But when you actually sit them down, explain to them, dissect it with them and pull it apart with them, I think even though they don't want to, but I think they have a bit of understanding, and it's also a series of conversations to have. It's not one conversation. So it started with that, and then I went on to have a few other conversations on different instances which I saw, or which she shared with me. And over a period of time, I think it was a sensitization process. So I think it's really important for us also, like, up until that point, even though I knew they were ignorant and oblivious to all of this, I didn't myself, working on this space, didn't think it was important for me to have that conversation with my mom. So it is really important for all of us who have that understanding to actually go out and have those constructive conversations with our parents. So I think that's the starting point, Sanjay.
Thanks, Mahisha. So that brings us, I think that brings this panel discussion to a close. I want to thank all the panelists for joining us, for sharing their views and their expertise with us, and also for the artists whose works were featured in this session, for their thoughtfulness and their energy in sharing and putting some of their experiences into these pieces of artwork. As for the issues that were discussed in the panel, I think what it requires is really humility from both sides. This is an intergenerational issue. Parents, I think, need to acknowledge that their children may have more knowledge about some of these things and need to be willing to listen and learn from them. But at the same time, children must accept that regardless of their lack of tech savviness, that parents do have the wisdom of years and can help them with some of these issues that they are struggling with. And as Marlene said, going forward, what is needed really is for more discussion, more interaction in order to tackle some of these issues of digital well-being.
Thank you to our young panelists for sharing their expertise with us on the most pressing technical or technological issues that not just children but even adults face in this pandemic. So many real and relatable issues were shared today. And as someone who doesn't watch much TV and only runs to the internet and social media for news and to stay relevant and be updated on current affairs, I myself am reminded, even as an adult, how much we need to be careful, how rationally we need to think about this. So thank you to our panelists, and also Sanjit Dias for leading us through a very important discussion, crucial to our work and studies and staying relevant today as we navigate this pandemic together. Thank you to our viewers on www.stages.lk/artsfestival and the Stages Theatre Group YouTube channel and Facebook live streams. Thank you for engaging and being a part of this discussion and for your comments. We've just concluded the final session of this arts festival. So what better time than this to hear from Pyumi Vijayasundara, our festival director for Children in Lockdown. Pyumi is a co-director of Stages Theatre Group and also functions in many capacities in the theatre as a theatre director, actress, playwright, and producer. So, Pyumi.
Thank you, Pema. So we have come to the end of our 3-day festival, and although what you saw was over a period of 3 days, This was a grueling and very difficult and challenging process to all of our artists and all of the children who you saw over the past 3 days. They've been working so hard over the past 6 months when they were commissioned by Stages Theatre Group with the support of Kindernothilfe. They worked over the past 6 months adapting, re-adapting, innovating, re-innovating, because of course we are in the pandemic and nothing is ever certain. So they've spent so much time, they've put so much love and passion and truth into all of the works that you saw over these past 3 days. So I would also like to say, we would have really loved to bring all of these performances, all of these panels to you live, but given the uncertainty of the time, this was how, we had to readapt ourselves. And we hope that even this way, we were able to reach you. We were able to tell your story, that you were able to hear yourself and see yourself in some of these performances, that you were able to hear from our professional panelists, and we hope that might have helped you in any way during this very challenging time that we live in. And I would also like to say, in any case you did miss any of the performances, don't worry, they are all available online on the Stages Theatre Group official YouTube channel. So you can just log on, you can watch all the sessions that happened, you can watch all the panel discussions, and even all the performances will also be shared as separate production links. And we urge you to sit down, not alone, because it's been a time where we've all been so alone and we've just been in front of our screens, like everyone here said. And so we urge you to sit down with your friends, sit down as a family, and sit down as a community to watch the amazing, incredible work that these children, these artists, these families have put together over the past 3 days. And with that, I would like to take a moment to thank all of the amazing people who came together to make this festival a reality. First of all, of course, I'd like to thank all the children who are part of these productions. So we also commissioned children as part of this festival. So first of all, a huge thank you for the incredible work you put in, the resilience you showed, and for everything you've done over the past 6 months and the past 3 days. And I would also like to thank all the children who were participants in our productions, in our workshops over the past few months. And our children, we had over 140 children who submitted artworks, which are also available on our official website, www.stages.lk/art exhibition. So you can view all the artworks from children around the island, over 140 children around the island if you visit this website right now. And I assure you it'll make you emotional, it'll make you laugh, cry, all of this. So please do log in there and try to look at all of them as well. And of course, a huge thank you to our passionate artists. We saw the lengths and depths that they went to make this happen. And especially, we kept shifting from live to digital, then back to live, and then back to digital, and all of these, with all of these complexities, they still kept pushing on and showing us that, this is like truly a celebration of creative resilience, and they showed us how it's done. And I would also like to thank our mentors who mentored our amateur and child artists to bring up all their creations to this level. So thank you to all of our mentors who were part of this festival. And of course, our moderators and all the panels. We had 6 panels over the past 3 days. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us in the middle of all your work. You thought that this was important enough to come and tell families, children, your friends about these issues. So thank you for that. And of course, like I said, it's been a tough process. It's been adapting, readapting, and with that, of course, we needed a little help. So initially, a big thank you to Kindernothilfe Sri Lanka, who were the main partners in supporting this 6-month commissioning process where we commissioned these 20 child and adult artists. So a big thank you to Kindernothilfe Sri Lanka, and also one of our first supporters that came on board in creating this festival, which is the Goethe Institute, where we are at right now, hosting the panels. And of course, along the way, we had so many supporters, partners, patrons who pitched in because they truly believed that this was a necessary and much timely need. So thank you to all our wonderful supporters, to all our patrons, to all our partners who came on board to make this festival a reality. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. And of course, our artist curators and our art exhibition curators, 2 young art exhibition curators, and our incredible festival team, who were the backbone of this festival. I'd also like to thank all our interpreters, all our translators, who are also part of the festival team, and of course our AV team as well. And last but not least, you, our wonderful audience. I know it might have been tough to sit through this because being online throughout the hours is a little difficult, which is why I urge you to take the time off your schedule. Schedule a little Sunday where you go and watch all of the performances that these children have done, that these artists have done, and all of the discussions that happened throughout these 3 days. Because, like I said, trust me, you're going to see something, you're going to hear something that will really make you think and maybe help you in overcoming some of the challenges that are to come. And with that, by the way, because we also have one final treat for you, which is Chatroom 2021, happening at 7:30 p.m. tonight. So if you've registered, please do sit in for Chatroom with your family and your friends. You're in for a treat. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope that you'll catch all the performances online.
Thank you, Pumi, so much for that. It's great to hear from you today, especially as we are about to close. Thank you, Pumi, for the hard work you've put in towards what I can only call a massive and yet, of course, timely undertaking. Throughout the festival, just to reiterate something that Pumi mentioned, throughout the festival that ran from the 26th of November, over 3 days, 6 artworks, 6 sessions, 6 artist talks, 6 panel discussions, and 3 workshops. We have tackled issues ranging from schooling in the pandemic to strained relationships within the family, to domestic violence and abuse, and of course, adapting to a digital world that has taken us over. The pandemic left the world of arts and theater high and dry. But you know that artists, no matter, anything and everything is an opportunity for them to create. So this is their response to the pandemic in a truly bewildering time in the world. Finally, just to remind you also that we have our final performance, Chatroom 2021, a reimagining of Enda Walsh's Chatroom, directed by Tasmin Anthony's, happening at 7:30 p.m. If you've registered for it, watch out for the email with the Vimeo entry and password and join us for that, because that is the only viewing of the show at the festival. So thank you once again for joining us on this journey virtually. That is a wrap from me today. And I hope that there will be a wrap on the pandemic too very, very soon. Until that, hang in there, be aware, and stay safe. Good night, and God bless.